We are in a life or death struggle for our own safety today and our survival tomorrow. Emissions are at an all-time high and the world just cannot wait. That's the warning from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres just ahead of the COP27 climate conference in Egypt. The 27th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change begins on Sunday, the 6th of November. It is expected to give inclusive and ambitious results acting on agreements, decisions and commitments reached in the past, including the Rio Declaration and also from COP26 at Glasgow last year. It is also believed to focus on a broader range of issues, including enhancing implementation and raising ambitious issues related to climate change. But coming at a time when the world faces unprecedented crises, what will world leaders deliver? What will be the outcome of COP27? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teena. Pleased to welcome on the show today an illustrious panel of experts who will share with us their views on the agenda and also the likely outcome of COP27. I welcome on this edition of the Global Debate Ms. Nicole Rycroft, Founder and Executive Director, Canopy, Mr. Mukul Sanwal, former Ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Sameer Quatra, Policy Director, NRDC, and Ms. Urmi Goswami, Senior Journalist. Thank you all for joining us on the program to discuss the outcome, the expectations and the objectives of COP27, which begins on the 6th of November. Ms. Goswami, since you're joining us from Egypt, take us through how Egypt is looking ahead to COP27. What is the vision for this important climate conference?
Egypt, which holds the presidency, is the incoming presidency, looks at COP27 as an implementation COP. Now, that's only natural because all the issues, most of the issues under the Paris Agreement, the rules are in place. Some further rules need to be made, but that the broad framework is done. So then our issue is to take forward what has happened. Also, as you mentioned, various, I think about 5 to 6 reports were launched last week, each one of them telling us that we are very far away from the Paris Agreement goal of limiting temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible. We're actually on the pathway between 2.1 and 2.9, so an average of 2.5 is where we are heading towards. So obviously much more needs to be done. It's also happening at the end of a year where we have seen immense climate devastation, whether across the world. So we have heat waves, we had floods, the flooding in Pakistan, heat waves in India, drought in Europe, and that's coming on top of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has created its own problems of energy crisis, aside from the geopolitics, but the energy crisis and the food crisis coming on top of the pandemic, which is driving many nations into debt. And that's it's an all-round crisis. It's like Adam Tooze described a polycrisis. Giving us a sense of what is expected out of COP27, Egyptian Foreign Minister Mr. Shukri sort of outlined it by saying this is a unique opportunity for the world to come together, to mend multilateralism, to rebuild trust and unite at the highest political level to address climate change. I think that becomes critical. Of course, there will be smaller steps or meaningful steps, actually, not smaller, that will be taken, whether it's on loss and damage, a very critical issue, on adaptation finance, on increasing efforts to mitigate, that's reduce emissions. But really, at the heart of it is the need to rebuild trust and to mend multilateralism. How can countries come together, trust one another, work together, and to take this common challenge we have to addressing climate change? Of course, other issues will emerge, which are finance. It'll drive into loss and damage and adaptation as well as mitigation.
Certainly.
But
we'll come to each of these aspects, and climate finance is something that's been spoken about a lot. So we'll come back to that in just a bit. But let me go across to Mr. Mukul Sanwal and understand from him, Mr. Sanwal, because if it is to be an implementation COP, if Egypt has set the vision that we need to move now from policies to implementation, from planning to planning and decision making to urgent decision making, the fact that world leaders will have to come together in the wake of unprecedented crises of all sorts. And as Ms. Goswami pointed out, it's like an all-round crisis on the environment front, on the geopolitical, on the socio-political front. So how do you see COP27 bringing together leaders of the world? What do you expect the world leaders to deliver?
There are two issues here. One is that although the goal is clear, but the goal is clear in terms of a temperature goal. It doesn't say, or there is no agreement, multilateral agreement on who has to do what. Now that has been the bug of this treaty right from the very beginning. Very difficult to get a multilateral understanding on what each country has to do. So at Paris, they decided that we will leave this to each country to determine what they have to do, when and how, under some broad parameters. Now, we call this an implementation COP, which is clear that the overriding policy issue has been clear, the direction is clear, but we still need to work on the details. Now, when those details we start working on, we strip into the area of who has to do what, and that is where the problem comes. As Urmi pointed out, there is a crisis of multilateralism at this point of time. I'm told that in the G20 meetings, the major powers are not even prepared to sit together for the group photograph. So the biggest challenge for the host will be how to get the major countries, who are the major emitters, to talk to each other. Now, once that is sorted out, if they can agree at least on an agenda for action, or at least a more specific direction of travel, that itself, I think, will be a great achievement. Coming to the nitty-gritty of this, the specific issues that different countries are raising, there again, the problem is that some of these issues are not ripe for a multilateral decision. In the sense, again, what is the extent of the problem? Who is going to face this problem in what degree and in what manner? Varies. And when that varies, you get politics into it. And that compounds the problem. So I think the realistic assessment would be that a more specific direction will emerge, but not the kind of solutions that we are expecting or that are needed.
Absolutely. Ms. Rycroft, the fact that, COPs are supposed to be the most important annual meetings when it comes to issues of tackling climate change. And in this state of chaos, what's required is a specific direction, as Ambassador Senwal has pointed out. In that aspect, how different is COP27 is the first question to you. And the fact that expectations, do you think we are setting the bar of expectations too high, given the scenario that prevails today among the world leaders who are actually the ones who have to lead by example?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. And I would say that one of the things that's really remarkable about and most exciting about this COP is that it is the first COP to take place on the African continent. And of course, Africa has been, responsible for such a small percentage of greenhouse gas emissions to date, and yet is kind of, like many countries in what's commonly known as the global south, bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And as of course, we're all living with the impacts of climate change now, with wildfires and droughts and floods. And so I think that's one of the things that actually is very interesting about this COP, is that it is happening in Africa. I think it does really pop to the fore the conversation around finance and the concepts like the forgiveness of debt or debt for conservation swaps, so that countries that have still rich natural forest ecosystems are able to actually afford to put them under conservation by being actually paid to do so in recognition of the revenues that they'll be relinquishing as such. So I think that, along with the pieces around loss and damage, that'll be a really interesting part of the conversation, and having this conversation with world leaders taking place actually in Egypt, I think adds greater currency to that. And then, of course, I think obviously at a diplomacy level, things are at a bit of an all-time low in terms of world leaders, let's just put it that way. But this is something that transcends one country's aggression against another. This will ultimately, make the Russian invasion of Ukraine fade in comparison in terms of impacts on energy availability. Like there are fears around the shortages that there'll be in Europe, the impacts and the social dislocation, the supply chain dislocations, and the economic dislocations that have been caused by COVID, climate change and the biodiversity crises both will dwarf the impacts that those kind of more man-made impacts, not that COVID was man-made, but the impacts that those have had on society. And I think what COVID has shown us that if we put our mind to it, and if world leaders put their minds to it and feel compelled to take action, then we can actually pivot quite quickly and take really quite dramatic actions to change the ways that our economies and societies work. And we need that same imperative brought to these conversations.
But whether we will see that
the next 2 weeks wrap up.
I think, Mr. Rycroft, we come back to where we start from. Expectations are huge, but, given the differences that have emerged, especially after the Ukraine crisis, whether that consensus in addressing this climate emergency that we are in will emerge is something that we'll have to wait and watch once the COP27 gets over. Let me bring in Mr. Sameer Quatra into the discussion, understand his perspective. At a time when accelerated efforts are required, Mr. Quatra, to address the climate chaos that the world today is witnessing, every part of the world has been affected by global warming, by the impact of climate change. How do you look at India addressing this issue? Because we, of course, also are at the receiving end. Considering that Glasgow was an important year for us, we set an ambitious goal for ourselves. A year later, where does India stand? What are we, looking to contribute at COP27?
Thank you, Ms. Cha. The science, is very loud and clear. The latest UNFCCC assessment of where the country's commitments are suggests that instead of keeping the warming well below 2 degrees or below 1.5, we are around 2.5 degrees trajectory right now, which is devastating. Which is devastating even more for countries such as India, which is home to very large population of people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And they are already facing the brunt of these issues. The entire South Asia, is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. There are three major issues, when India is concerned, and it's going to be a balancing act for India. First of all, there is a clear need to raise ambitions. Only 24 countries since the last COP have actually updated their nationally determined contributions. So which means the entire world needs to do more. And then, like Urmi and other fellow panelists have pointed out, this is a need for implementation, because just, setting long-term targets and goals and announcements is not going to get it there. And then there is the issue of equity and justice, because as others have, referred to, there is this trust deficit. There's this doubt on the effectiveness of multilateralism working out. As far as India is concerned, India, on the one hand, can justifiably claim that we did not cause climate change. If you look at historical emissions from 1850 to date, India's contribution is just 3.4%. And India, during this period, has been home to a sixth of humanity or more. It's probably going to be a fifth soon. So, we can stand back and say, we didn't cause it, but that's not going to be enough, because, we have to be a part of the solution. India is, even though the per capita emissions are very low, total emissions when you aggregate, India is one of the third largest emitters. This is the time to raise ambition for everyone, all the countries. But that said, it is also equally important to do so in a just and equitable manner. Western countries, rich countries, have promised, if you go back 7 years to the COP in Paris, there was a promise of 100 billion of climate finance, which if you look at the total investment needed for the world to decarbonize is nothing. The world needs trillions. But even 100 billion has not been met so far. The promise was that by 2020, they'll reach the level of 100 billion of climate finance annually, and they haven't still met that. So there is clearly this trust deficit, and investment is required not just for decarbonization, but like Urmi pointed out, to actually account for the damages that are already happening due to climate change. They are irreversible losses. Some of those are happening over a very long time frame, very slowly, gradually, but surely. And some of them are more rapid, like we see the floods, the extreme heat waves that happen in India. So while India domestically is doing a lot, if you look at India's actions, in India has one of the largest renewable energy expansion programs in the world. India committed to having 175 gigawatt of renewables by this year, and despite COVID, supply chain, economic hardships, is poised to get there soon. So there may be a little bit of a delay, but it'll going to get there. And then at the last COP, India has raised its ambitions significantly. But at the same time, it is in our own interest, the country's own interest, that we redefine the paradigm for development, that we do not just copy the economic model of the West, which was just so fossil fuel intensive and which has brought the world to the brink of this crisis. So it is in our strategic interest, it is in the interest of energy security, it is in the interest of populations that are suffering from climate change in every village in India to every part of the world.
Certainly, and at the same time, India has also committed, Ms. Goswami, to raise the voice of the developing countries when it comes to climate finance. Now, this is an elephant which the United Nations describes as one that never leaves the negotiation room. So since 2015, 7 years on, we've not been able to live up to the past commitments, let alone enhancing commitments to address the climate emergency that we are reeling under. Does COP27 promise to change all of that? Can climate finance become a reality post COP27? Is there any word from the developing economies?
Okay, I just want to sort of make the problem seem worse than it is by saying it's not a promise from 2015. It's actually a promise from 2009. In 2009 at Copenhagen, the developed countries promised to give developing countries up to 100 billion, but 100 billion a year by 2020. That promise was reiterated in Paris and it became 100 billion a year. So it's it's an older promise. So as I said, to make the problem worse than it is. But before I address your question on finance, I want to quickly address the question of India, because India is going to take over the G20 chair, and India is in a very interesting place. India is going to be the G20 chair. It's a special invitee to the G7, but it's also at home with the LDCs, and it kind of understands the problems. It understands the conversation at the rich countries table, and it understands the conversation at the poor countries table. And we have seen India take steps in the past that kind of bridge this world. And the International Solar Alliance is a perfect example of that. How do you harness the power of collective action? And you mentioned climate finance, which is what your main question was about. In the Fifth Assembly, which concluded in Delhi just ahead of the COP of the International Solar Alliance, there was a resolution passed on a risk guarantee mechanism. So basically, how do you ensure that investment flows to those places where investment doesn't want to flow? Because after all, what is investment? You put in money so that you get returns. But what happens to places which are so risky, where maybe political risk, maybe economic risk, maybe some other risk, money is not going to flow, but they need that money. So perhaps the time has come for India also to put forward such ideas, not just at the G20 when it takes over the presidency, but here at Sharm el-Sheikh, to throw open the idea. Another thing that India is doing, which is interesting, is life, the lifestyle for the environment. Again, it's a very powerful statement where the government of India or India is saying that we understand that we haven't created the problem, but we have to be part of the solution. And I think so. Therefore, India has a very special place. It basically it has shown audacity to stand up and say, yes, we can do many things. And I think it's time to persevere on that, on the question of audacity. On climate finance, am I expecting that at the end of 2 weeks, all our climate finance questions are going to be magically resolved? No way. As a matter of fact, we are actually at such a perilous time in terms of global economy that I don't really see any answers coming, any definitive answers coming. But you know, the beauty of the Paris Agreement is about direction of travel. Can we take those steps that give us the direction of travel? Can we go forward on the Bridgetown agenda floated by the Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley? Can we go ahead on the risk guarantee mechanism, which the International Solar Alliance, which India has championed to move ahead? Can we find those answers? Can we find those spaces where there can be potential answers? Are we moving from just finger pointing, which is important? There is a place for it. There is a reason to remind people of their promises not kept. But can we go beyond that?
Absolutely.
Can we point fingers and talk about solutions at the same time? And if we can do that, that will be a huge achievement at COP27.
Absolutely. Ambassador, the fact that, individually there are several countries that have accelerated steps to mitigate the crisis, towards adaptation, there are efforts being taken. But the fact that it has to be a collective action when you're addressing an issue like climate change, and that is not visible, what do you think can be done for the world to actually now move from implementation and planning to action, because that's clearly the need of the hour?
I think it's a very good question, because and the answer was really provided by Prime Minister Modi some time back. The point he really made was that you cannot find a solution by adopting the same path which created the problem. So what he really said was, and Urmi referred to this as well, that look, we need to change the paradigm. Let's start looking at human well-being. When you start looking at human well-being, you also ask the question, what is the cause of the problem of climate change? That is anthropogenic activity, that is the activity of each individual. So once you start focusing on the individual, rather than focusing on the science, you move the needle, or you move the direction of travel towards something that is more intelligible to the electorate in each of the countries, because they are the sufferers, they are the causes of the problem. So really, he's reframed the problem, or he's attempted to reframe the problem. The point is that it is not likely to be accepted at this point of time. The idea of climate justice reached only as far as the preamble in the Paris Agreement. Prime Minister Modi had raised this for the first time in UNESCO, in the United Nations in UNESCO. He's again reiterated this with the Secretary General. The question is that, can we make that paradigm shift of focusing not on production but on consumption patterns? That strikes at the heart of the problem in the sense of lifestyles. And what is India doing about this? When you look at what we are really doing is, in a sense, what we have started is a technological shift away from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. A large number of indigenous companies imports are of electric vehicles. I myself drive an electric vehicle and find that it is much more economical, much more convenient than, to name the car, than the Honda City I had earlier. Now the question is, this is going to pick up more. There is a waiting time for electric vehicles in India. Similarly, the solar energy. The tropical countries are rich in solar energy. They have this huge resource which is not tapped, because development took place in temperate climates, and there you have a problem of sunlight. The third thing, of course, is the way urbanization is going. Do we need to follow the American pattern of vast suburbs, more than 2 cars for each family? And I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. India has shown that you can be the 5th largest economy and yet have per capita emissions which are way below the global average. And now Prime Minister Modi has tried to put this into a conceptual framework. The question really is, how far is this going to be acceptable? Because here we are talking about an impasse at the diplomatic end, that for the last, really, right from 1990, really, we have been talking about climate change. And we have not made enough progress. Every year we find the problem is more acute.
That's right, Ambassador. And the fact that we take two steps,
shift it down the line.
We take two steps and we are forced to take a step behind, considering the fact that crises, the geopolitical crisis, for example, triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war, they've destabilized the efforts. They've pushed back all sorts of efforts by countries when it comes to moving towards green energy. So, Ms. Rycroft, in that aspect, how do you look at the world actually fulfilling the ambition of moving towards green energy, something that will help us preserve our environment, because we have only one planet. There is no planet B. We keep talking about it every year. It's the same story, 2 steps ahead, 1 step behind. And particularly after the pandemic, the last year has been chaotic for the world.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's been chaos, but I think your point around renewables, and I would broaden it out to be supply chains more broadly. Like there really needs to be a redoubling or kind of a quadrupling of effort to transform these unsustainable, carbon-intensive supply chains, be it the energy system, plastics that are driven by fossil fuels, industrial forestry, which is degrading the shields that we have against climate change, kind of the world's forest ecosystems, or big agriculture. And so, although supply chains aren't necessarily thought of as, the most charismatic things to speak about, you're completely correct in that is where the majority of our footprint lies as individual consumers and global citizens, as well as societies and countries. And so really accelerating the transition away from these, really, they're relics of the 19th and 20th century. There's kind of the old energy production systems based on fossil fuels, making packaging from 400-year-old trees. We need to leave those supply chains back in the past century and really accelerate the transition to these circular, more sustainable, low carbon economies and production systems that are relevant to the 21st century. And India is really well positioned for that. There's a vibrant textile industry in India. Waste textiles, rather than going to landfill, are perfect for making next season's viscose and clothing. Straw that's burnt with significant impacts on public health across India, perfect for making straw that the various goods and commodities are shipped around the world. And so I think it's both a need for prioritization by governments, and we've seen that, late to the party, but a promising step by the US government this year with their infrastructure bill. Obviously, there have been some significant steps within India as well, but governments leaning in to really take action as well as upping their commitments. And then the private sector, I think, really starting to step in because they're conscious that given the impacts that COVID had on global supply chains and their vibrancy as businesses, that they can't afford for a disruption that's going to make COVID
despite
look like
these problems that you've mentioned, the world has indeed taken some steps, but perhaps considering the problem, solutions are too less. Mr. Quatra, I'll take one last question from you. Time is running out. One last question on the way ahead.
I'm optimistic, despite all the challenges that we just discussed. Overall, I'm hopeful that the humanity can come together to tackle one of the most challenging crises that we've faced. The future generations are looking to leaders of today, and India is one of those leaders. India can show direction on how to move away from mistakes of the past, and the geopolitical situation actually is helping give more momentum to this debate for decarbonization. If you look at fossil fuels are so geographically concentrated and can potentially be weaponized, as we've found out. Moving to decentralized renewable energy, which is more equitably distributed, is in every country's interest. India has already started working a lot on climate adaptation. More than 100 cities in India have heat action plans. So India has a lot to share with the rest of the world, which is suffering on climate adaptation. And then, as one of the strongest voices, India providing support to the need for equity and justice to the developing and less developed countries, and also making sure that the Western richer countries fulfill their promise, bridge this trust gap. We've done this before. Today is also, the conclusion of a Montreal Protocol discussion. Environmental multilateral treaties have worked. The reason we don't talk about the ozone hole is because the countries came together, worked on science, and solved it. We can do this too. There is a need. This moment is asking for a leader to step up. And India is, one of those countries that can rise to the occasion.
Clearly. So how, India can do that, because the window of opportunity is too little for us, is something that we'll have to wait and watch. So completing the Paris rule book, moving towards mitigation, adaptation, and climate finance, another important aspect that we've discussed is something, and loss and damage. These are some of the objectives that the COP27 has laid out. But apart from that, whether there'll be new commitments, whether there'll be new promises, and whether the world is able to move towards some kind of climate action is something that we'll have to all wait and watch. But for now, we'll have to wrap up the discussion. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. So viewers, thank you for your time as well. That's it from us on the program today. I'll see you same time next week. Until then, take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.